Hi, thanks so much for joining me. This is Dr. Richard Herbold, and today I'd really like to talk a little bit about a subject that a lot of people don't want to hear about, and it's gluten. And gluten I've been talking about for the last 35 to 40 years in my professional career as being a pro-inflammatory food. That having been said, in the last 5 to 10 years, the escalation as far as health issues has just exploded. And one of the reasons for that is what we've done to it. So in food processing, gluten is no longer, which is the protein, gluten, let's start there. So it's wheat and then it's gluten. Gluten is the protein which we're sensitive to. Proteins are what we are allergic to. So when we look at foods and we look at what we do to foods, in the food industry, not only have we genetically modified this glutinous source of wheat and other grains which have gluten in them, but we also have deaminating them. So deamination is basically, in food processing, making things available to go through machines. So it's no longer a protein found in a food, it's what we've done to it. So if we look at this little cryptic chart over here, wheat basically has a protein called gluten. And gluten, that protein, is inflammatory for pretty much everybody. Doesn't mean people always have a reaction to things, but gluten, because of what we've done to it, has become very inflammatory. And it's also the redundancy of exposure to our immune system. Gluten turns into gliadin, and gliadin is a subfaction. So for somebody to be tested for a gluten test, in commercial testing, alpha gliadin is available. The problem is there's alpha, beta, gamma, and omega. So if we're looking for one protein and there's 3 other proteins, the probability of finding on a reliable basis something that's there is no longer very reliable. So we talk about gluten testing, and we talk about gluten testing in the medical environment. Unfortunately, it's very, very inaccurate. So to diagnose somebody with celiac disease, which is a whole different kettle of fish, there needs to be an endoscopy, which is an invasive test where they put a tube down your throat. They need to find a blunting of the villi, which are the portions of the intestinal system. They need to take the gluten out of their diet, let those regenerate themselves, put it back in again, check for the blunting again, put it back in again. So this diagnosis of celiac disease is a pretty torturous process. What I'm talking about here is a food reaction as compared to a true fixed allergy. Now there's both, right? But the complexity of saying I do have a sensitivity versus I am celiac is very, very different. And part of it is what I've broken down over here, in that wheat, which is the mother food itself, turning into the protein called gluten, which is one of the most aggravating components in that food chemistry, but it also turns into gliadomorphine in some people. Those are the people who are so addicted to wheat because it turns into morphine compounds and it stimulates opioid receptors in our brain. So those are the people, when you take the gluten out of their diet, they feel horrible, much more emotionally, not necessarily from a gastrointestinal perspective. And then we have a lectin, which is a protein sugar compound that you could be sensitive to, like wheat germ and gluten. Those are your sprouted grains. And then we get down over here to glutenin, and then we get down to transglutaminase. Transglutaminase, tissue transglutaminase, 3 different types of tissue transglutaminase, 2, 3, and 6 that we know of that affects GI system, skin, and brain, is part of the diagnostic component of celiac disease. You might have it, you might not. And then there's genetic markers. So when you look at HLA, DQ2, and 8 genes, those are the markers that people carry for activating the gene to become celiac disease. And then we get into the deamidation of gliadin, which is the 15, 17, and 33 mers. It's complicated, right? It sounds complicated because it is complicated. It's not just wheat, it's not just gluten, it's not just gliadins, it's a whole big mess. So to give you a little taste of the complexity and why so many people are so confused of saying, do I have an allergy? Do I have a sensitivity? We'll talk a little bit more in another video, but just to whet your appetite a little bit about the complexity, here's the initial piece that I wanted to share with you. So I hope as a background this is helpful, and join me again for a little bit more information.